Right, members. First item is to confirm the minutes of the council meeting which took place on the 20th of February 2018. Are you agreed that I sign these as a correct record? Agreed. I will sign these later. Mr. Taylor, are there any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've received apologies from councillors Pat Frost, Michael Goodridge, Stephen Hill, Christian Hesse, Martin Lear, Kika Mirrlees, Libby Piper, Sam Pritchard and Liz Wheatley. Councillor Peter Martin has apologised that he will be a little late as he is elsewhere on Chairman of the County Council business.
Thank you. Item 3, declarations of interest. In accordance with the Waverley Code of Conduct, do members have any non-pecuniary or disclosable pecuniary interests to declare? Mr. Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Tom Martin has previously declared a non-pecuniary interest in item 14 in relation to minute 123 Godalming Cricket Club, as he is a director of Holloway Hill Recreation Ground where the club plays.
Thank you. Are there any other declarations? Nope. Right, Mayor's announcements. First of all, I have mentioned to some of you that there is a little bit of history regarding a warship called HMS Hambledon, which was adopted by Hambledon District Council. We will be revisiting this at the next meeting, which is Mayor making, and you will get a full explanation of what it's all going to be about before then. So I hope that's whetted you. You're excited now, aren't you? The only other thing I would like to say is, as you know, Fiona Cameron has now been promoted to take over Emma McQuillan's old job, and so I would welcome Fiona to the role. Congratulations. And could you reassure us that you don't have any interest in caravans?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Right. So moving on, item 5. Have we received any questions from members of the public?
None received, Mr. Mayor.
Have any questions been received from members?
None received.
And have any motions been received from members?
None received, Mr. Mayor. However, I understand you wish to propose a motion.
Yes. I would like to propose that this council sends its congratulations to the royal family on the birth of their Royal Highnesses the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge's third as yet unnamed child. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Now, you will see that there's been a presentational change to the agenda, with the Part 1 items shown as individual items in the agenda. However, to reassure members, the order of business this evening will be the same as usual. The executive minutes Part 1 first and then Part 2. And as usual, as always, if you wish to speak on a Part 1 item, you simply put your hand up. If it's a Part 2 item, if you haven't already notified your intention to speak, you won't be able to. So, minutes of the executive leader of the council to present, please.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I'm pleased to present the minutes of the executive from the 10th of April, and I believe I have a seconder.
Pleased to second, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, agenda item 8 is Local Plan Part 1, and that relates to an additional item brought before executive, which was for the executive to approve a supplementary estimate of £100,000 to cover the commencement of engaging external legal counsel in respect of defending Waverley Borough Council on the 3 judicial review challenges to its adoption of Local Plan Part 1, and that these be met from the Revenue Reserve Fund. I think it's fair to say that having gone through due process, having followed numerous public consultations, having gone through an extensive period of both inspection and hearings, it was extremely disappointing that this plan, which we have all worked so hard to bring forward over so many years, now finds that it is being challenged by 3 different parties. What I would like to reassure members, and I'm sure that the portfolio holder will speak a little more on this, is that the local plan as it is at present carries full weight. And it's important that our residents around the borough bear that in mind and are fully aware. And you've already seen members, again, across the borough, how that has been used successfully to overcome certain appeals and in defence of certain planning applications just since the adoption in February of our local plan. I am appalled. I've said it before and I will go on record as saying it again. I'm absolutely horrified that the various groups involved feel it appropriate to waste council taxpayers' money in this way. We have to defend our local plan. We've said for a long time we want appropriate plan-led development. This is what the plan gives us. And for parties now to come in and try to sabotage that is absolutely despicable. And I think, quite frankly, there is little more that I can say on the matter other than to ask members to actually approve the additional supplementary estimate of £100,000 in addition to the £100,000 already approved by the executive under their delegated powers at that meeting on the 10th of April to start the defence of our much needed local plan. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Are there any speakers? Councillor Poroszewski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Leader, I too share your disappointment and anger, and I agree. I think it is a very low point for them to be coming in at this stage and trying to undo all the hard work that's been done. But, Leader, it's my understanding that POW and CPRE, in its decision to challenge by judicial review Waverley's Local Plan Part 1, ticked the box in their application against Aarhus. And I don't mean Aarhus as in Denmark's second largest city. I mean Aarhus, which enables them to limit their cost to just £10,000. Leader, can you confirm if this is the case? And if so, please can you explain to me, members, officers, and all those hard-earned taxpayers who spend their hard-earned money, how that is possible and fair? Waverley will have to spend, yet again, hundreds of thousands of pounds defending its lawful local plan. That followed due process to the letter of the law, the local plan endorsed and approved by members and an inspector and the Secretary of State. We should be spending money on essential services and improving the lives of our residents, and not wasting money or micromanaging delays by those undermining the process. How much more time and money is going to be spent? How many more excuses are these opposition groups going to come up with? POW and CPRE had every opportunity to present their challenges before now on the platforms the leader has already outlined. And now, installed with the safeguards to minimise their risk to just £10,000, you, the taxpayer of Waverley, is expected to spend, put essential services at risk, add another £1,000 minimum to the bill, and expect you to pay to defend its lawful, upheld, democratic decision. That's what I call a double standard. I call it hypocrisy, and I do think it's grossly unfair. There's no justification on this planet that would explain the rationale behind it. So, Leader, if you could clarify that, I would be most grateful. Thank you.
Leader, would you like to wait until we've had all speakers? Councillor Isherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I can only say I agree with the previous speaker and our leader. Last summer, the Waverley Borough Plan Part 1 was subject to a lengthy examination in public by Inspector Jonathan Borough. He found the plan sound with certain modifications. The Local Plan Part 1 was adopted by this council on the 20th of February this year. The plan means that instead of Waverley Borough Council being subjected to developer-led planning in the absence of a local plan, we are now plan-led. The Local Plan Part 1, together with, for example, Farnham's neighbourhood plan, made in 2017, has already been effective in the refusal of what was considered inappropriate large applications. Other neighbourhood plans are moving forward, we hope rapidly, with NFPP rapidly approaching. They have a vision for the future of local town or village areas, and planning policies will be used to determine planning applications locally. Our local plan has now been challenged by POW and CPRE, who have lodged a legal Section 113 challenge in the High Court against this council's regarding the policies of housing constraint contained in our Local Plan Part 1. I would ask for an assurance, Leader, that we set up a most robust defence of our plan. This is at considerable cost, as all things legal appear to be. This money would support many of our local organisations. I mentioned just two: the day centres, or Hopper, our community transport services. We must ensure that when costs have been awarded to Waverley, against POW and CPRE, and POW is a limited company, that all measures are taken to recover our substantial costs in full. And I ask the Leader of the Council to see a meaningful defence of our plan is in place. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And now, Councillor Storey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Moving on from the point that the Leader made, yes, I can confirm that at this point the Local Plan Part 1 is adopted and carries full weight in all decision making on planning matters, in area planning committees, in joint planning, and is being taken into account at all appeals. As has been mentioned already, several existing appeals which were waiting for final decision from the Secretary of State have been turned down as a result of the strength of the local plan. Despite the fact that the individual planning inspectors who originally sat on those appeals were minded to allow the appeals, the Secretary of State has then used the weight of the local plan to turn them down. I've had various people suggest to me that there are aspects of the judicial reviews which we shouldn't be defending. Why is it, for example, that if there is a move to remove the working unmet need, why should we defend that? And the answer is that we adopted a local plan. We have accepted the entirety of that plan, and that if we decide now to cherry pick, oh, we quite like that bit, or we don't quite like that bit, then the credibility of our decision is completely destroyed. And then the viability of the plan goes with it. We must maintain our support for the entire plan, and despite the incredible amount of money that it takes to defend these things, I wholeheartedly support the recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I don't take quite such a harsh line as the members who have already spoken in respect of this, because I think actually we are here to serve the residents, and we should respect the residents' right to seek to correct decisions or change decisions if those decisions are wrong, and it's going to be up to the courts to decide whether or not those are wrong. I am very concerned with the language being used. Despicable. You despise your residents. I'm sure they'd be pleased to know that. I just don't think we should be talking in terms of our residents in that way. We can't say ourselves here whether those people are correct or incorrect. I certainly always felt that it was, and as I know a lot of other members here did, believe that taking Woking's unmet need was not necessary. Certainly there was no appropriate assessment which would show us that we should take that rather than Woking. I do recall myself from the ONS meeting on the 15th of February that the members of the OS committee didn't want to allow any scrutiny. Well, if things don't withstand scrutiny, how are you now turning round and saying that this is such a wonderful plan? Surely, you know, if it was the very, very best that we could do, then these challenges wouldn't be happening, would they? But nevertheless, you know, we face those challenges, and it is very difficult to get a challenge through the courts these days. It's even sometimes difficult just to get it to be accepted for judicial review. So I'm sure if they are a waste of time and a waste of money, then the courts will decide so, or if the authorities feel that it shouldn't be allowed. I think the residents who are challenging would no doubt counter by suggesting that this council should have listened at earlier stages, and they're entitled to leave it until it's adopted, because obviously you always hope that sooner or later the council will change its ways and correct matters so that judicial review, which is a last resort, so that it's not necessary. But I think that as far as this is concerned, the one question that I would like to ask is what would the status be of LPP1 during this challenge period? I mean, it is adopted. We give it a lot of weight. Members here are suggesting, oh, it's all being thrown in the bin. As far as I'm concerned, my understanding is that actually it will lose very little weight during the challenge period. But I'd like you to explain exactly what difference it would make to our decision making and what we would lose, because I think that if there are mistakes, we should allow the public to correct them if mistakes have been made. I think we should respect the people that we serve a little more than some members seem to want to.
Thank you. Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. At the last discussion on this, many councillors spoke on the local plan and on the potential areas where we might see some legal challenge, though this was not ultimately reflected in their vote. And I agree with Councillor Hyman that scrutiny outside of full council was actually fairly toothless. In quite a long session, we didn't actually discuss a lot of the detail. So I have three small questions. How do areas with legal question marks get onto the local plan and declared sound by the inspector? If, for example, the piece of land is subject to a restricted covenant, how do we declare it sound if it's under covenant? Can I have firm assurances from both the Leader of the Council and the Borough Solicitor that we actually have some hope in court of winning these defences, and that, like other fellow councillors here, we actually do seek to reclaim all of those costs where possible? And could I also ask the Leader to comment on the potential consequences beyond the financial if Waverley loses this challenge? How is that reflected in the plan if we lose? Thank you.
Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I fully support the recommendation to approve a further £100,000 to fight for our residents against the local plan judicial reviews brought by some groups in the borough. In the short time since adoption, the local plan has already proved itself to be a powerful tool in preventing large-scale development around the borough. This Conservative administration will not stand by and allow armchair pressure groups to hold our residents to ransom, strip away their protection and throw them to the mercy of overdevelopment. Tonight we're recommending a further 100,000 on top of the 100,000 already approved at executive. But we will come back to members as many times as is necessary to ensure that the resources are available to fight for our residents' rights to scrutinise developments in their communities. I urge you all to support the recommendation.
Hear, hear. Councillor Adams.
For Councillor Hyman's suggestion that we're disrespecting residents. I'd like to remind him, because I'm sure actually he was in the council for much of the time, that residents have been consulted continuously throughout the whole of this process since it started in 2013. There was a major consultation initially, which gave us, from the 4 different options, a decision that Dunsfold Park was one of the
Point of personal explanation, if I may, Mr. Mayor, because he's missing the point.
Please don't interrupt. Thank you, Mr. Hyman.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, are we not allowed to interrupt to make a point of personal explanation?
No.
My apologies.
Please continue, Councillor Adams.
Following that initial consultation, we then had a number of presentations, both to members and to members of the public, since during the whole of the development process. And the CPRE and POW had extensive opportunities to discuss their issues during the inspection, and in fact took advantage of that extensive opportunity. So it isn't as if they haven't been listened to. It isn't as if they haven't had their points taken into account, and the inspector still made his decision. As far as taking Woking's unmet need is concerned, it's quite clear in the MPPF that we have, as part of our housing market area, to cover the whole of the amount of housing required in the housing market area. And although Woking haven't actually done a specific SMAR themselves recently, there is a SMAR covering the whole market area, which has allocated a sum of housing to Woking. And that, unfortunately, is what the inspector has said that we must cover. So I would completely dispute the suggestion that this has not been thoroughly consulted on, thoroughly discussed, both inside the council and out. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Ramsdale.
May I make a point of personal explanation, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mayor?
Councillor Hyman, you will have your opportunity in a moment. I am taking speakers in the order in which they have put their hands up. Councillor Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not a massive fan of the local plan. It didn't have absolutely everything I wanted to see in it, and it had some bits that were rotten to me. The funny thing is, though, that we didn't all agree about all the bits that we didn't see as most appropriate. We all knew we had to make a collective compromise for the sake of the entirety of the borough. And yes, there are some issues that we had to compromise on which were being forced on us, such as the unmet need from Woking. But we need to defend this plan, because certainly that plan is a lot better than no plan at all, as being decidedly proven time and again in cases, especially appeals, since we made that decision. Of course we've got every right to criticise people who continue to object on a NIMBY type approach because it's not quite right for their area. Why can't those people see the greater, better, bigger issues? And yes, I regret the fact we're going to have to spend money that could be spent on looking after the needy in our community, that's now got to be spent on expensive lawyer bills, perhaps on both sides, because the people bringing these cases have got their costs limited. I think these other groups need to appreciate that they need to be working for the sake of all of the community, as indeed I believe everybody's motivated to do in this chamber here tonight. But thank you, Leader, you have my support in allocating these funds, albeit I regret that it's necessary.
Thank you. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just as a point of personal explanation, it was said by Councillor Adams that in respect of this council respecting their residents, and then he went on about how they had opportunities to be listened to or whatever. That wasn't the point at all, Mr. Mayor, that I was making. It was that the leader had said that the people who were doing this were despicable, and I think that should be withdrawn. I do not think that it is right to say that members are, and that's what I heard. I'm pretty sure, and we can check it on the webcast another time, that it was personal, as opposed to saying that the action was despicable, and that's what I heard. And I think that should be withdrawn.
You have had your chance to make the explanation. I will leave it to the leader's discretion as to whether she wishes to change anything that she has already said. Councillor Else.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I merely wanted to reply to Councillor Hyman's assertion that our leader had said that our residents were despicable. That is not what she said. She said the action that they took was despicable. There's quite a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have no more speakers unless somebody... No, right. Leader, would you like to answer those questions and sum up?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Thank you to councillors for clarifying the words I used earlier, and I hope that that's clarified for Councillor Hyman. Just to go back on some of the points that have been raised, I think it's really important, and I'm going to take these in no particular order, that we remember, as I said earlier, that the local plan has already withstood a lot of scrutiny in terms of defending a number of developments in Farnham. We've also had the successful defence of Chanrossa as well, over in the eastern part of the borough, to name just a few in the last few weeks. So clearly, that plan is doing its job. To answer and clarify the question raised by Councillor Forozewski, I can confirm that both POW and CPRE have ticked the box, as it were, and asked that they be allowed to apply for ARAS. And that means that if that were to be granted, their costs, should they be unsuccessful, would indeed be limited to £10,000 each. It goes without saying that we as a council and our legal representatives will be rigorously defending this application by the parties. If they believe they have a really strong case, if they believe in what they are trying to fight and the case they are bringing, then they need to also be prepared to match the money. Now, I'm not going to keep on about the cost to Waverley. You've seen the costs that we're talking about. Councillor Follows himself has already asked, will we be taking actions to fully recover all costs? We will. But for anyone with any legal knowledge, you will all know, as we saw with the Farnham JRs just a year ago when we were successful there with Brightwells, you never fully recover all your costs. We will have officer time, we will have certain legal costs, and no court ever awards the actual true cost of a legal action, certainly not a judicial review. So yes, we will rigorously defend this, we will pursue costs, make no bones about that, But there can be no doubt this is going to cost taxpayers, Waverley residents who pay their council taxes. In terms of questions that have been asked about POW, Councillor Isherwood raised the fact POW are a limited company. Clearly that is of concern. Any limited company, as many members will know, can dissolve, can liquidate themselves at any time. We will be doing all we can to ensure that, again, we are fully protected as far as can be, and we hope, sincerely hope, that that doesn't happen if POW, for some reason, which we expect will happen, are unsuccessful in their claim. But it is of concern that we have groups taking the council to court over an implemented legal local plan which has followed due process, as Councillor Adams and others have pointed out, over a number of years, been the subject of hearings. They themselves had the opportunity and did indeed appear at those hearings, and still they try to get away with minimum costs and maximum costs to the council and Waverley residents. So, in summary, Mr Mayor, I'd like to thank members for their support. I'm sorry Councillor Hyman doesn't feel the same way, but I think, in fact, I know that we need to move forward, approve this recommendation tonight. We are confident that we can move ahead and defend these claims, and we will do so at every opportunity, and we will rigorously defend them in the courts, should it come to that. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Right, members, the recommendation from the executive is on page 2 of the agenda. Is that agreed? Agreed. We now move on to item 9 on the agenda, community infrastructure levy. Leader.
Mr Mayor, thank you. Item 9 is the community infrastructure levy, and that is actually approval to submit the draft charging schedule for examination. We've already undergone 2 consultations, and this enables us to move forward with the draft and ultimately look to implement CIL, or Community Infrastructure Levy, something we've discussed and worked on for a long time in this council, and something which we really need to move forward so that we can again start to really target development and ensure that we have the right contributions to plan for the future. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Storey.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The adoption of Local Plan Part 1 allowed us to move forward with the process for introducing community infrastructure levy, and we have now, as the leader has just said, gone through 2 consultation periods which have brought forward many interesting points which have been analysed, considered and incorporated as appropriate. Fundamental to the CIL and the level of charges is the viability of developments. And I think that those people who have commented on the level of the charges need to remember that we have actually put in a very large buffer of 50% into that viability assessment. And so we are confident that these are charges which will be found to be responsible and good. I won't go through the report, I'm sure you've all read it. All we need to say is that we are ready for inspection. The There is a planning inspector who has been appointed, ready to take this on. As soon as we have agreed our recommendations, we can submit our application. We expect hearings to take place in June or July, and that we should be ready to adopt the SIL charges in the third quarter of this year, with the actual implementation taking place at the end of the year. You must give, obviously, developers an opportunity after adopting to get themselves into the right position to start the payments. We will be providing a dedicated resource within the planning department to monitor and oversee the administration of SIL, and we hope to appoint somebody to that position fairly shortly. The table of minor modifications is simply to delete from the consultation document, before it goes for the examination, those parts which are not relevant to the inspection. Things like the Regulation 123 list, which has to be submitted, but it's not part of the main charging document. So those minor changes are just to tidy up the documents that will be submitted. I recommend the two recommendations and hope that we have your support.
Thank you. Do we have any other speakers on this? Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just a little puzzled about the student housing comments. There are comments here, no new accommodation identified, we're about to build some in Farnham. But the one that really puzzles me is, if I may quote from here, given the limited amount of such accommodation in Waverley, it may be difficult to meaningfully assess, terrible split infinitive, the viability of such developments. I don't understand that, and could someone explain it to me? And it goes on to say, in addition, whether such a development would be liable for SIL would depend on the landowner or the developer. I rather thought that depended on us. So could someone just explain that to me, because I find it rather strange.
Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, this item has been in front of us and the ONS committees a number of times. I've made a number of comments, and particularly in respect of the way that the Thames Basin Heaths and the Wealdon Heaths are treated within it. For instance, affordable housing it should not be excluded from contributing towards SAN costs. But having said that, this is very much a broad brush, the CIL. It is a long way from being an exact science, and we're never going to get to perfection or anywhere near from it. A little bit disappointed that there are so many documents which we don't have in front of us. It's always nice when we're making decisions here to have actually read the stuff that's going forward, but I entirely take Councillor Story's point that most of the documentation has little impact upon the examination in public itself. They are secondary documents, and it is just the draft charging schedule, which we've got in front of us, which is going to be looked at. So I would recommend everybody supports this, because we've already lost enough money in not having a local plan that's workable, put together many years ago. We're a long way behind some other councils. We're only going to get half the money we'd like to because of how far we are behind. So let's at least get this in place and let it go to examination. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Well, Leader, would you like to answer and sum up without splitting any infinitives?
Grammar never was my strong point, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Just to sum up, in terms of the document, indeed, as Councillor Hyman says, it's been before the ONS committee twice. It's also been to consultation twice. There are some technical questions that Councillor Ward asked, and I'm happy to get him a written answer from those. That was part of the technical analysis by the consultants, and I'm afraid I don't have that level of detail, but I'm happy to get an answer for you. So that's absolutely fine. And I'm very pleased to hear that Councillor Hyman feels able to support this, and I hope that we can all support this and move forward with this as soon as possible. Thank you.
Right, members, the recommendations from the Executive are on page 3 of the agenda. Are those agreed? Agreed. Right, we move on to item 10, property investment strategy. Leader.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. The item 10 is property investment strategy. This item covers the property investment strategy for estates and the operating model for the Investment Advisory Board going forward. I believe there are some speakers to this item, so I will leave them to tell members and explain a lot more about this item. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Holder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the members' room before coming here this evening, I was advised that I need to speak for no more than 7 seconds, but I think that would have been just about time to stand up and sit down again. So I am speaking, but not as much as 4 minutes. Our brief was to produce a strategy that allowed the Council to fund investments through the use of its reserves, capital receipts and prudential borrowing in order to offset the funding shortfall over the next 3 years from 2018 to 2021, mainly due to reductions in government grant funding, and produce service provision whilst minimising the burden on local council taxpayers. All borrowing had to be made in accordance with the conditions of the Prudential Code, and all investments subject to the extended powers created by the Localism Act of 2011. With these provisions in mind, we had to determine a strategy that covered the following criteria. 1. How much did we need to borrow to generate enough income to cover our budget shortfall? 2. What type of assets should we acquire that generated that income? 3. How long did we need to borrow it for? We reckoned on a period of between 20 and 40 years. And fourthly, what would be the minimum required net income, our RRR, required rate of return? After allowing for fees, stamp duty and refurbishment costs, we decided that the minimum RRR would be 2%. The Council had already set up an investment advisory board, and this investment board had acquired at least 12, in the last 12 months, 4 properties generating a gross rental income in excess of £800,000. In addition, the Council already owns some 49 properties. If appropriate investments arose, we would commit up to £30 million spread over 3 years from 2018 to 2021, with no more than £10 million on any one individual property. Our preferred lender would be the Public Works Loan Board, which lends funds to local authorities at preferred rates. We reconstituted the Investment Advisory Board, which would comprise of 6 councillors, 2 from the Executive and 4 from the backbench, supported by 5 officers from the Council. It's all laid out on page 61 of your agenda papers. The procedure would be as follows. The Investment Advisory Board would appoint a commercial property estate agent whose responsibility it would be to find suitable properties, investments that fulfilled our investment criteria. Once found, the property would be visited by 2 members of the Investment Advisory Board, accompanied by the Council's estate manager. If suitable, the full Investment Advisory Board would be convened to examine the property in depth, and then, if satisfied that the property fulfilled all the investment criteria, recommend a purchase to the Executive. The decision would then be ratified by the full council. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other speakers? Councillor Band.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And first, I'd like to congratulate Councillor Holder in distilling the half dozen meetings and more we had into a 3.5-minute summary of this report. It is a very comprehensive document, and it took us a long time in drafting and working together, I have to say, with officers to get to where we are today. But it is most appropriate, in my view, that this strategy is brought to Council at this time. Councillor Holder rightly referred to the importance of the medium-term budget financial strategy and the impact and the importance of property investment revenue coming to contribute to that strategy. And in the light of that, and in the light of members' concerns when previously this topic has been discussed, it seemed to us appropriate to update the investment strategy with what you have before you. It does include delegated powers because in a fast-moving property market, speed of action is one of the vital issues to be successful, and we did think it appropriate to propose that. As a result of that, this strategy is slightly more restrictive than what came before councillors in the past. But that does not prevent executive coming back to council if they find opportunities which are outside the limited terms of this particular strategy. It was deliberately constructed that way, but I accept it's not perfect, and will need updating with experience. It covers not just acquisition, but it actually covers property management and property performance reporting. So it's a comprehensive document, which I commend to all councillors, and I welcome in particular the commitment in the recommendation to review the strategy again in 6 months. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, the item covers the property investment strategy for estates and the overall operating model for the Investment Advisory Board. The strategy itself covers areas such as funding, prudential borrowing approach, and goes on to set net return criteria and diversification targets for our whole property portfolio. Crucially, the strategy formalises the due diligence process, the performance reporting, and sets a robust framework for the long-term governance of the Investment Advisory Board and any future investment acquisitions which come before it. There can be no doubt, Mr. Mayor, that the acquisitions made to date have yielded fruit, but this report sets the parameters for future acquisitions, ensuring that a proper balance is achieved between risk and reward and that a solid process is observed through the acquisition process and throughout the holding period of the investment. I'd personally like to thank the members of the Value for Money O&S Committee Working Group and the officers in the Estates team for their tremendous hard work in putting this together. I would urge all members to support the recommendation.
Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One very, very quick question. I'm pleased to see the changes in the actual construction of the advisory board. I was just wondering if anybody could tell me how that is actually going to be created. Who is picking the 4 non-executive councillors, and will it be subject to the same rules as committee structures in terms of representation? Thank you.
All right, Leader, would you like to take that question and sum up? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I'm pleased to also be in a position to thank both the officer team who worked so hard and the members who were so heavily involved in this piece of work, an excellent piece of work. As Councillor Holder was saying earlier, 4 property investments are so far yielding us approximately £800,000. That has helped to plug a hole in our funding, but it's about more than that. We've always said that we wanted to be able to offer exemplar services, and at times when our finances are really challenged, and those of other partner organisations, we need to be able to have funds in place that we can really offer the crucially needed services to our residents in Waverley. Another point to note, and I just want to draw out, is the fact that, as Councillor Band said, this will be subject to ongoing review on a 6-monthly basis. That, again, is extremely important, and I know a lot of work has been done in terms of the entire governance aspect. The members of the board, to the point raised by Councillor Follows, who's actually preempted my appointment of the board, they are appointments by the chairman. It's a board, and therefore I'm happy to read out the names of those who've been appointed. So the chairman is Councillor Jed Hall. The other member from the executive is Councillor Jim Edwards. We then have 4 members from the backbench, Councillors Mike Band, Denise Legel, Mike Hodge and Peter Martin. I hope that clarifies the questions that have been raised, and I'm pleased to support the recommendations, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Well, the recommendations from the executive are on pages 3 and 4 of the agenda. Are those agreed? Agreed. We'll move on to item 11, Treasury Management Framework.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I'm pleased to present the Treasury Management Framework for 2018-19, which also comprises the revised Treasury Management Policy for 2018-19, the various Treasury Management strategies and the investment strategy, and the prudential indicators. I'm not sure if anyone wants to speak further on this item, but Councillor Hall may wish to say a few words. Thank you.
Councillor Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This item covers the Treasury Management Framework for 2018-2019. The Treasury Management Framework essentially covers the money market operations for the cash management of the Council. There are only very tiny changes to the existing framework, which was previously approved. However, we are required to reapprove the framework annually. However, Mr. Mayor, a query was raised at Executive and at ONS regarding the use of derivatives. So I'd like to be completely clear on this issue. The Treasury strategy does not give us the ability to use derivatives. We have no intention of seeking permission from Council to use derivatives in the foreseeable future, and the sentence in the report which mentions derivatives has been in the Treasury Management Framework for at least the last 5 years that we can find, and again does not give us the ability to use derivatives. I would urge you all to support the item.
Councillor Hyman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Yes, this is something which arose, I'd noticed it in the Value for Money, Customer Service and Value for Money ONS papers, approximately getting on for a month ago. And we didn't have time to cover it at that meeting, but the following day at the audit meeting with the auditors present, I noticed that in our documents in front of us that it did mention derivatives that was within the audit reports. So I raised this at the time, and our finance manager gave us, the audit committee, an absolute guarantee that we were not and had no intention whatsoever and would not be investing in or dabbling in derivatives. No question of it whatsoever. That was the answer. So if I refer you to page 81, Treasury Management Policy 4, which is in front of us, just give members a moment to get to it, page 81, halfway down, you'll see TMP4, approved for instruments, methods and techniques. And there's 2 short paragraphs there, and the second paragraph there, Mr. Mayor, says, should Waverley decide in future to use derivative instruments for the management of risks, these will be limited to those set out in its annual Treasury Management Strategy. The organisation will seek proper advice and will consider that advice when entering into arrangements to use such products to ensure that it fully understands those products. Now, I think members of the public out there will be scared stiff by that. And I would very much like, and I asked that executive, if it's true that we have absolutely no intention of dealing in of investing in derivatives. If what the finance officer said to us at the audit committee meeting recently is true, that we've got no intention to and won't, then that paragraph should be removed. And I don't understand why the executive is trying to make excuses for not doing so. Why not remove something if we're not going to do it? Because granted, it does not say we're doing it this year. It would have to be in this year's policy if we were going to, but that leaves the door open for something which we're told the door is closed to. So I would like to move that that second paragraph be removed from this document before, because I don't like being told two different things at once. One's true, one's not. And if what the finance officer said is true, that we're not going to be looking at derivatives, investing in derivatives, then I think all members here should be satisfied that we haven't got it written somewhere into a document that allows it to come forwards at some point. If it does need to come forward, we can be asked, can't we? We're all big enough to turn around and say yes or no at a future date, if we are going to dabble. But to leave it in there, for me, when we've been told no, we're not doing it, I think would be completely wrong. And I think it would be remiss of us as members just to overlook it and decide, oh, well, let everything go through. If we end up losing multi-millions of our residents' money on derivatives in future years, hey, we didn't notice, we're unaccountable. No, our residents want us to be accountable. And I can see the Conservatives think it's funny that they should be that we might expect them to remove something which will allow them to deal in derivatives later. Well, I know there are different sorts of derivatives. This is not. It's very much a simple matter. We've been told not. Let's remove that paragraph. So I move that paragraph be removed, and I think I've got a seconder in Councillor MacLeod. Thank you.
Sorry?
I'm just saying happy to second.
Thank you. Are you proposing an amendment then, Councillor Hyman? And if so, what is your amendment?
I think I've made that clear, Mr. Mayor. Can anyone guess? Can we remove the second paragraph there, please, under TMP4? That is my motion. That is removed before this is before we agree to adopt this Treasury management policy. I think that's straightforward.
Right.
We don't need to go into any more details. I mean, it's just a vote, I think.
And you have a second yes.
Yes.
We will then put it to the vote.
No, debate.
Oh, debate.
The amendment.
Yeah.
You might want to speak.
Yeah.
So do we have speakers?
Are there any other speakers? Yes, Councillor Mulliner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I can understand Councillor Hyman's difficulty with this area. Certain words do seem to have a rather automatic effect on some people. My early career, and sadly I'm not as young as I was, goes back to the early 80s, and I was an interest rate swap dealer then. Some derivatives have been around for over 40 years. Some have been around for a lot less. And the ones which a council like this will get involved in are extremely banal, straightforward things. And it would be astonishing if anyone thought that a council with this amount of cash to manage would not have access to them if it needed them. The truth is, of course, we have been in for some years a very low interest rate environment. Therefore, there is no need to manage interest rate risk at the moment. And that is why, at the moment, the Treasury management strategy, which is approved every year, does not contain any permission to use derivatives. But what is said in the report on page 81, while it might be worded slightly more happily, is perfectly proper. And indeed, it means that we are not so naive as a council and a cash management body. We've never even heard of these things and have no idea what they mean. No one knows what the future will hold. Although interest rate rises are expected to be mild, it is not impossible that in 5 years' time they could be very much higher, or even in 3 years' time. No one knows. Anyone who thinks they can forecast the markets is deluding themselves. So it could be that we could need to use derivatives at some time in the future. It is perfectly proper for this document to make reference to that possibility And of course, if it did change, this council would have an opportunity to decide whether or not to allow the Treasury Management Strategy to be amended accordingly. So I regard Councillor Hyman's suggestion as frankly verging on the hysterical and something which does not complement the intelligence of the rest of this council and indeed large numbers of our residents as well. He reminds me frankly of Don Quixote vainly chasing a windmill simply because one word, derivatives, seems to give him the heebie-jeebies. They're not. Some of them are dangerous and some councils did get burnt using them. Given this council's use of very conservative management techniques, I'm quite sure that Mr. Clark and others would run a mile before using anything other than the plain vanilla variety, which has been used for many years by many banks and other bodies handling cash. But if that happens, they will come to this council and ask that the future management policy strategy be amended accordingly. But it's quite right, in my opinion, that there should be some reference to this possibility in this very important document. There is absolutely no reason, in my opinion, why we should change this document as it's written, and I, for one, will not be supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Gray, do you wish to speak to the amendment?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think that both at the Audit Committee and here, Councillor Hyman expresses a valid view. I think the usefulness of having this in here is that we've had this discussion. We've actually highlighted it. We've brought it to the attention of members, and members have had an opportunity to actually discuss it. I think the other thing that's important to say, it's in there and the process for including it is specified, that it will be included in the Treasury Management Policy. I would not be in favour of removing it because I like the transparency of having that paragraph in there, and I would like confirmation that I am right, that the Council would have to fully endorse a change to the Treasury Management Policy before such derivatives were used. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor MacLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If Councillor Hall is giving us an absolute assurance that we're not going to use derivatives in the near future, I'm perfectly happy to accept that insurance. But I must admit, I don't quite understand why the paragraph is in there in that case. I think it possibly leads to more potential alarm about the Council's attentions and is necessary. And I would like to understand if it is true that an insurance was given at the Audit Committee that this paragraph be removed, as Councillor Hyman suggested. Either it was or it wasn't. Could we have that point answered, please?
Councillor Hyman?
I think I can wrap up. Is that correct? Thanks. Yes, I'd just like to clarify, actually, for Councillor MacLeod has misunderstood what I'd said in respect of the Audit Committee. We didn't discuss the paragraph was here because actually when I brought it up at the Audit Committee meeting, people thought I was dreaming, said I was wrong, the usual rubbish, and I knew I'd read it in the documents, but I had to go home and find it and then bring the matter up and address it as it should be. The issue here is that we as members of the Audit Committee were given an absolute assurance. Now, if I'm going to go along to Audit Committee meetings and be given an assurance when I raise a matter and I ask, and an officer, I respect a great deal, tells us, all of us, including the chairman, that we are definitely not going to be having anything to do with derivatives, and that is what was said, then I do not expect us then a few days later as a full council to be saying, yeah, well, okay, we will. Which is it? So that's why I'm asking for this. It is simply a matter of, if we're going to agree here that finance officer is wrong and I shouldn't take his advice in future, then great, but where do we stand? I can understand that there is a political will for us to be able to spend people's money and be unaccountable. So, I still put this forward as a motion because I think that we should be playing safe. And frankly, if what Councillor Hall says, he can insult as much as he likes in this chamber, but it doesn't change the fact that his finance officer told us that we were not going to be, and this allows it to be done. So, who am I going to believe? I don't care about the insults. You can try as much as you like, but the facts are in front of you here. This paragraph is here, and I'm saying it should be removed. And
Councillor
if you're right,
Hyman, I think you're just repeating yourself now.
Please bring. If you are correct, there is in that it will have to come to us. Why not agree to remove that? Is there any reason? I see no reason why anyone in this room should not agree to remove that. Because
Councillor Hyman, please.
It's going to come back to us,
enough.
apparently.
You are repeating yourself several times now.
Well, I think perhaps it's needed for some people to understand, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Leader, is there anything you wish to add to this?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I think Councillor Mulliner summed up very well. Just so that we're really clear, this is, if anyone's scaremongering, this is Councillor Hyman, and it's absolutely inappropriate to do this. The facts are very clear. We have this in our strategy, as Councillor Mulliner was saying, because derivatives exist. We have to recognise it. If we didn't recognise it, then equally we'd be accused of not being transparent. So in answer to the question that Councillor Gray asked, it's a very simple yes. And it's not in our strategy this year, and only Council can approve it. So if we were to take that route, we would come back to Council. So I think that makes the whole position extremely clear, and I, for one, will not be supporting the amendment, and I would urge all councillors not to support it, and we stick with the policy which has been approved for the last few years and our prudent financial management, of which we have an excellent reputation as a council. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, the amendment is that the relevant paragraph be removed. Could I see all those in favour, please? 3. And all those against? Don't we need to count? Are there any abstentions? Sorry, any abstentions? The amendment is lost. We will now return to the main debate. Do I have any more speakers? No? In that case, Leader, would you like to sum up?
Mr. Mayor, I'm sure members don't want to hear my voice all evening. I think I've summed up very well on this particular item, and I'd like to urge everyone to support the recommendations before them. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. The recommendation from the Executive is on page 4 of the agenda. Is that agreed? Agreed. We move on to item 12, Housing Strategy for 2018-23. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Moving to the housing strategy and the housing, strategic housing and delivery. It's certainly been several years since we published our housing strategy. It's very important that we set out the aims and objectives, and that is what you will find in the report before you. We're working extremely hard with our housing association partners and our own development team, bringing through a significant and exciting programme of house building, both now and over the next 5 years. And we're waiting at the moment for a number of government policy announcements on the revisions to the NPPF and social housing in general. You will see, members, that this policy is divided into 4 sections, plus a glossary of housing terms, and I'm sure that all members will be really pleased, as I say, to see this excellent piece of work by officers and the portfolio holder before them this evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to briefly emphasise the word delivery in this document, and I want to congratulate the Housing Department on delivering new houses at Oxford Ridge. I'm sure my fellow ward councillor will join me in recognising the excellent work done by this Conservative Council in building and renovating homes. Our aim must be decent homes for decent people. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Ramsdale.
I read this particular strategy with a lot of interest, and the thing I thought was particularly good about it was the use of smart objectives. The objectives, the way they were spelt out, were so clear, obviously measurable, and time-bound. You got the impression that perhaps the portfolio holder had done this sort of thing before. Seriously, I'd like to congratulate everyone in housing, but in particular Carol King, our portfolio holder, for such an excellent piece of work in the strategy, and because it follows success in the implementation on the ground that I think was reported to us just this last week. But thank you so much, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Mrs King.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to my colleagues for their kind words. The housing strategy, which starts on page 99, is a long document, but it's not a planning document, but it sits alongside the affordable housing section established in the local plan and shows how we as a council intend to meet the housing needs of all our residents who can't afford a home on the open market. Along with our housing association partners, we're building new and affordable homes, as the leader said. We're using our own land, our own properties, and sites coming through the planning system. We're doing well, but we need and we want to do a lot more and are looking to extend our reach by introducing new models of delivery in the future. This is a living document, and it won't be left on the shelf to gather dust for the 5 years of its life. It will be reviewed annually by the Housing ONS, who I thank for the work they did in reviewing the document in the first place. And it will then be brought back to Council each year to show how we have measured up to our ambitions and just how smart we actually are. I commend the strategy to Council.
Thank you. Councillor Forozeski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too would like to offer my congratulations to Councillor Carol King and to thank you for the time you spent this morning talking me through some of my concerns and observations that I had, so I very much appreciate that. It can be very confusing when we've spent a long time in this council over the last few months listening to developers talking about affordable housing and what we actually understand to be real affordable housing. I think housing and planning are two entirely different things and not to be confused with market-led housing and the spin and interpretation that's put on it when they're talking about affordable housing. But again, like everybody else, I think this is an excellent report and I think you've done a really good job on it. I think the office's contribution is really outstanding, but it's really what we need in partnership with our housing association. This is more of what we need, so I absolutely approve the recommendation. I think it's a great thing. Thank you very much.
Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Bolton, my ward colleague in Godalming, Oxford and Central. I would just like to quickly say, firstly, it's good that this council hasn't resorted to the somewhat extreme and callous reactions of some Conservative authorities in the south of England, and actually we have quite a good homeless strategy that does seem to be working very well. I would also like to say that I want to give my thanks to the officers particularly involved with the Oxford Ridge development. They have been working tirelessly to make sure it's delivered and to engage with certainly the residents in myself and Councillor Bolton's ward and with any of their queries. I would also just like to say it's fantastic that the tenants panel also attend the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I know there's several councillors here as well as myself who work with those chaps on a regular basis and get good comments back and help in assisting residents with their issues. I know I certainly have. And finally, I would just like to say, hopefully, when we get to next year's and later in this year's Overview and Scrutiny for Housing, that hopefully we'll be able to start looking into some of the contractor control and procurement issues for subsequent developments on Oxford Ridge, which have been some of the major concerns that we've seen of late. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Band.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to join others in congratulating the portfolio holder and the officers for producing this updated strategy. I don't think any of us can underestimate the importance of the provision of more affordable social housing in our towns and villages. Without it, the lifeblood of our towns and villages will drain away. We need the mixture of housing to be able to keep the vitality of these places alive. And so I'm extremely pleased that in our particular village, there are now 5 new affordable houses awaiting their new tenants, and I look forward to welcoming them. Thank you very much, officers and portfolio holder, for what you have been doing. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I hadn't intended to speak on this, but yes, it is very good to see all the work that's gone into this and the effort the tenants panel have put into it too. And I am pleased to be able to support this document, but as Councillor Bolton opened up this debate with mentioning Oxford Ridge, I would like to ask, now if we go back to the very beginning of this meeting, I asked a question in respect of the local plan and what the challenges would, how the status of the local plan might change due to the challenges, and I didn't get an answer to that, so I'm not really expecting an answer. Some of these questions are far too difficult, I understand. But for Oxford Ridge, what's the total cost and the number of homes gained for that total cost? Please, if you could just remind us in terms of how affordable this is, as Councillor Bolton did bring the issue up. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're one of the few councils, I think, that's actually building houses at the moment, and I think we should be quite proud of that. I think we are the envy of many. Councillor Fortescue mentioned the difference between planning and housing, and it reminded me of something. If anybody's not been to Oxford Ridge, do go up there and look at the quality of the houses. There used to be days when you could walk along and say, oh, there's the council houses and there's the rest. Go and look at these houses. Look at them inside if you can. Look at them, my pet fetish. They all have electric car charging points outside. But go inside. They've got separate thermostats for the top floor and the bottom floor. And my thoughts were planning. Let's get these wonderful things that we've done with our houses and move them into the sort of things we expect other developers to produce as well, because we're leading the way here. And we want other developers to keep up with us. We're not running along behind them, which is the case in many places. And as the chairman of the Housing ONS, I can confirm that we did look at this very carefully. We thoroughly endorse it to the executive, and I thoroughly endorse it to this council. Thank you.
Well, I don't think there are any other speakers. So, Leader, would you like to sum up?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Yes, to the points that Councillor Follows made about procurement and working with contractors, I know that's been an ongoing learning curve at Oxford Ridge, and certainly, yes, absolutely happy to go on record supporting the comments that you're making. It's very important, given the scale of the Oxford Ridge development, a multi-million-pound development, that we really do ensure with those new homes in the phases as they come forward, that we do our utmost to minimise disruption for residents, but absolutely ensure really good quality delivery of those properties in terms of the costs and the actual quality overall. I think to the points made by Councillor Ward, I was very fortunate to be invited to the opening of a scheme by Thames Valley Housing in Farnham just a couple of weeks ago. And it's a scheme that I first came into knowledge of when I was on the executive back in about 2012, when Councillor Band was leading on that with Councillor King, and we were looking at the old dairy crest site up in Waden Lane, and going there a couple of weeks ago and seeing the transformation there. absolutely amazing homes. And I'm very careful about my choice of words there. They weren't flats or apartments, they were homes. And I think that in itself is what's so important, that we see coming forward with all forms of affordable and social housing. They really were a real high spec, and I was certainly really pleased to talk to the people who were occupying them and had just moved into the properties and were really making them their homes for the future. If Councillor Ward wants much more detail in terms of all the costs for Oxford Ridge, then I can make sure you get a full breakdown. That's not a problem. Save us to say it really is a multi-million-pound investment over a 5-year period. So it is significant for the council, both in terms of the refurbishment of the homes and the additional homes that will be coming on board for Oxford Ridge as well. And on that note, Mr Mayor, I would like to commend the recommendation to council.
Thank you. Well, the recommendation is on page 4 of the agenda. Is that agreed? Agreed. So we move on to 13, homelessness strategy.
Mr Mayor, thank you. The homeless strategy for 2018 to 2023, we are required by government to produce the strategy for preventing homelessness every 5 years. When there is an awful lot of material here, we are statutorily required to present this. I would say, and I don't know if Councillor Mrs King wants to add to it, that we've got an excellent record in preventing homelessness, but we can never be complacent. Things are changing within our communities and out there in the wider world all the time. And we, as a council, have been very proud of our record. But as I say, it's something that we have to continually work on to ensure that we do our utmost for anyone who may be unfortunate enough to find themselves in that position. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor King.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Mayor. This borough is really fortunate, I have to say. We have by far the lowest numbers in temporary accommodation across the whole of the region, as you'll see on page 172. And as the leader said, our track record is exemplary in preventing homelessness in the borough. This track record leaves us very well prepared for the new legislation, which is very challenging. Came into effect on the 1st of April. And although footfall hasn't been noticeably greater as yet, and we hope it stays like that, the amount of administration and paperwork and reporting to government has escalated considerably. The team is strong, stable and high performing, and I have every confidence that our housing options team will continue to deliver such excellent service to our residents into the future. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Do we have any other speakers? Councillor Bond.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd just like to comment on our homelessness strategy obviously works extremely well. The populace don't actually necessarily understand that. I get questions from friends and neighbours and other people about the problems that we see in the press about homelessness, and particularly about the people who are rough sleeping, of course, which is an additional problem. How do we promote the fact that we are doing so well and telling the world that Waverley is Waverley and we don't have the problems that other places like Guildford have with regard to rough sleepers and homelessness? I think this is a wonderful document. Thank you.
Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I also agree with most of what's been said. I remember going to a housing ONS relatively recently where there was a discussion about one of the potential gaps, which was due to the relative ruralness of Waverley. We needed to keep a watching brief of unrecorded rough sleepers and homeless. So I'll just note that we should be continue to be vigilant in that regard. But other than that, no, generally I think it's been a positive strategy, and I hope also that the council will in the future start to look at some of the more wider root causes of homelessness in the borough, and also think to consider an increase in approvable housing percentages, especially for developer-led projects, where in general they do try and push the numbers down. My hope is that we can increase the number that we demand as a baseline in the future, which I think will contribute to tackling some of these root causes. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There was an allusion made to that we are required to do this by government, and of course we are, but unfortunately the government in its wisdom keeps moving the goalposts, which makes the amount of paper we have to produce multiply exponentially, and it is really very, very difficult. And I must repeat what the Housing ONS Committee said, that we do congratulate the Housing Department on the way they work. I think it's very difficult when someone arrives to find out if they have any association with the borough, if they have a need rather than a desire. But I think they do a remarkable job. But if the goalpost could just stay still for a little while, I think it would help us enormously.
Councillor Story.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A few months ago, I was at Farnham Station waiting for my wife to arrive on the train from London, and there was a young man wrapped in blankets sitting outside the down platform, and I spent some time chatting to him to find out what his situation was, and he was indeed rough sleeping where he could. I am pleased to say that I was able to contact the council and talk to the right people here, who got in a car and came over to Farnham Station to talk to the young man in person, to intervene on his behalf to see if they could put him into some accommodation and alleviate his rough sleeping. I just want to say I think that's magnificent, and all credit to the officers of this council.
Oh, thank you for that bit of good news. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. Very quickly, yes, we do have an excellent record on homelessness. I've been lucky enough to be able to drive to London and back twice today already, so I had to listen to the radio, and I understand from the reports that I heard on the radio today that there are massive rises in food bank usage where universal credit is in place, and that's something which obviously I think all areas have got coming to them unless the government changes its position, and it doesn't seem it's going to. So how good we are is going to be tested, I think, over the coming years. I think it's very good at least that we are starting from a strong position. But let's hope our performance can stay as good as it has been in the past. And thank you very much for all the hard work that's gone into this document. And yes, I think we obviously support its adoption. Thank you.
Councillor Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to very briefly join the congratulations going on all around. Perhaps to bring out Councillor Story's personal contribution in that story he's just related to us. To those of you commenting on the need for paperwork, I guess that paperwork's needed because there are councils out there who are not achieving what we're achieving, and they're probably under different political control and not using the government's direction.
Thank you. That is the last speaker that I have, unless somebody's hand goes up quickly. So, Leader.
No, I think the only thing I'd like to add to that is that, yes, clearly there are a number of causes of homelessness. I think we all recognise those. We do have to work and will continue to work with various organisations, both the county and especially the CCG and certainly other sort of health and community organisations, because clearly there are, as I say, a lot of reasons why people are rough sleeping. To Councillor Hyman's point about food banks, I indeed saw several reports on the news today about universal credit and increased use of food banks. It is most unfortunate if that happens. We are in a strong place at the moment, and we should be proud of our strategy before you tonight. But as I said at the beginning, nor should we be complacent. Officers and the portfolio holder and the ONS have done a superb job on this, but we cannot, on something this grave, ever be complacent. But I'm very pleased to see this before us and pleased to endorse the recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Leader. Right, the recommendation from the Executive is on page 5 of the agenda. Is that agreed? Right, we now move on to the part 2 of the Executive, and I have the first speaker, Councillor Story, on minute 114, Local Plan Part 2.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to elaborate on what is an item to note, other than just to bring you up to date on a few things which have happened recently. We have, as part of the improvement in communication, instituted a series of road shows, as it's being termed, where officers from the planning department go to visit town and parish councils who have requested assistance with understanding the planning operations. One of those has happened so far in Tilford, and there are 3 others already planned: Busbridge, Hambledon and Wannish, and those will happen in the next 2 months. I'm pleased to announce that Building Control, under their new strategy, have won a contract with the developers of the Woolmead in Farnham to provide the building control services to them. And the good, the bad and the mediocre bus tour, looking at some of the developments within the borough and the allowing members to make their own minds up as to what good design constitutes, was held with 20 members roughly going on that, coming back with quite different views to each other on what constitutes good design. But that's just to keep you up to date with what's going on.
Yeah, don't sit down, Councillor. Minute 116, Development Management Improvement Plan.
I don't think I put down to speak to that.
Right. Advice from officers? No. Yeah, no. Councillor Richard Seaborn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to raise a question in relation to minute 122, the performance management report. Can't help noticing numerous examples of this administration's joined-up thinking as we've progressed through this evening's meaty agenda. We started with the defence of the local plan. While the plan may not be perfect, it remains absolutely clear that 2 pillars of the plan are critical to the borough. We've already seen the plan deliver defence against large unwanted speculative developments, and of relevance to the question that I'm going to pose shortly, the plan also seeks to improve the overall sustainability of Waverley by delivering affordable housing which will enable increasing numbers of key workers in the less well-paid sectors of the economy to live and work in the borough. We've also just approved the new housing strategy, which is a key document in managing the affordable component of the housing required by the local plan. And this strategy builds on the work already being undertaken by the council, for example, the excellent rebuilding and refurbishment project at Oxford Ridge that we've already talked about. Moving on to the item which I really want to talk to, performance management, our papers highlight the continuing improvement in managing void relets in our council-owned properties. This is a great example of the M aspect of the housing strategy, making the best use of existing homes. But the point I really want to bring out is the fact that this is being delivered by a stable, motivated team in the housing services area. This is set against one aspect of the performance management that is reported quarterly but does not have a target and is actually causing some concern. This is the issue of staff turnover. Levels of quarterly staff turnover have been noticeably trending upwards over the last 9 years, and it's inevitable that those service areas experiencing higher levels of turnover will be challenged to deliver the same excellent performance that we've seen from the team working on voids. So can I ask the leader if she would agree that by implementing the local plan and the new housing strategy, this council will provide increased levels of affordable housing, both market and social, which will improve its ability to recruit and retain staff at Waverley Council and thus stem and hopefully reverse the trend in staff turnover. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Leader, do you want to respond to that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Seaborn, for your question. Yes, absolutely. The local plan, coupled with the housing report that was before you tonight, really will help with the recruitment and retention of key workers around the borough. Waverley itself has experienced real difficulties recruiting and retaining staff over the last few years. In a number of areas, we've discussed it at various committee meetings, and it's been brought before you at council meetings. The cost of housing in this area, the cost of living, is exceptional, and trying to recruit, we have staff who commute an hour to 2 hours each way a day, some who are sometimes in bed and breakfasts during the week, because they can't afford to actually live within the borough. Likewise, talking to one of the owner of one of in fact the largest employment site in our borough, he has a number of businesses at that site who again have to work in that way. It's a real issue. It's a real issue in terms of how do we house, how can key workers afford to live in this borough? And I know as the school governor myself, just a couple of years ago, we had to go out 3 times to recruit the headmistress of a primary school, simply because no one could afford to come and live anywhere, not just in Waverley, but in the surrounding area. So it is a huge issue. It's one that we recognise, and it's one that we've got to continue to do all we can to address through our local plan and through all other means. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Peter Martin, Godalming Cricket Club lease.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Godalming Cricket Club and the recreation ground at Holloway Hill are both within my division, within my ward. The other member is Councillor Tom Martin. I would just like to welcome the decision by the Executive to enter into a 30-year lease agreement with the Godalming Cricket Club for continued use of the recreation ground. The Godalming Cricket Club runs many adult teams and cult teams, and they do a remarkable job, and I look forward to 30 more years of leadership from that club in the sport profile of Godalming. Thank you.
All right, I have no more speakers on part 2. So, Leader, do you wish to exercise your vocal cords any further on these minutes, or shall we move to the...
Mr. Mayor, all I will say is that concludes the minutes of the Executive held on the 10th of April 2018. Thank you.
Are they agreed? Agreed. Item 15, minutes of the Audit Committee. Councillor John Gray to present.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm pleased to present the minutes of the audit meeting on the 27th of March, and I believe I have a seconder.
Pleased to second, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, there are no items under Part 1, and I'm sure you'll tell me if there are any speakers under Part 2.
I have one speaker in Part 2, Councillor Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I spent a little bit of time on the Audit Committee, and as a result got interested in this issue about how councils get houses back into their control. And I think one day I was at home feeling a bit lost and turned the TV on, perhaps a big mistake. And the TV programme seems to consist of a series of councils failing to get houses back under their control. They're either going to appeal again, or the person was going to be given another chance. And yet, here, almost lost on page 227, para 54, fraud investigation, we've got 8 houses coming back under our control. I'm not sure about the maths that seem to claim that we're recovering the capital value of each of those, but it's certainly good news and must be linked into the high success of our housing team and the homeless team, in that we've got, houses that are not in the wrong hands, and we've got a really active team that have been really successful. So whichever portfolio holder wants to grab the praise for that, can they please take the thanks of at least one member and to the appropriate teams that are doing that work. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Gray, come up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, thank you for Councillor Ramsdale for your comments. If I could just add something to that, this is a small investment by Waverley, which personally I think gives a very good value. And this operation has been going for a number of years, and it's run by the internal audit area within finance, and the figures are quite remarkable. And although the numbers are not great, they're based on referrals, and in the last year we've had something like 112 cases referred. Now, a lot of these go by the wayside with review, but a number of them have produced very good positive outcomes. There's 18 properties being taken back, and in the case of 4, then there has been rejections of council tax discounting. So a lot of good work here. It's not just the figures that go on. The fact that we do it does have a halo effect. It does encourage. I think Councillor Ramsdale refers to the figures. The financial figures we're given, they're a notional benefit that's given to us to use for these. So that's probably why you find some of them strange. But the benefit, as per these notional benefits, is 481,000, and we expect that to rise in the full year to get to something like 600,000 or 700,000. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Well, that concludes those minutes. Are they agreed? So we move on to item 16. There are no exempt items to consider. Thank you for attending. The meeting is now closed.
Please rise whilst the Mayor leaves the chamber.